Welcome to my economics channel, where I love discussing the subject, not topic, as I've been calling it before, and I love to make it something fun and interesting to learn. And in today's episode, I actually have part 4 of my ongoing series on EE's video titled, Are the Extreme Economic Systems Totally Pointless? And this will be the final part of the series, and I believe it's the most interesting. He has some of the more outrageous claims, he saved them for the last part of the video, and these are the claims I'm going to be taking down for this video. If this is the first time you're seeing this mini-series, I strongly recommend you go back and watch the other 3 parts, not only for your own knowledge, but also to give me more views, and eventually make me money, which was always good for me. But without any further ado, we're going to get into EE's video, and in particular, in reference to the Industrial Revolution and the factory system and output in general, EE has this to say.
Labour was made far more efficient by capital, but labourers were not the secret ingredient, so they didn't really benefit from it in the same way that capital owners did. In this sense, the aristocracy, in conjunction with an early free market, had answered the questions of the central economic problem. What should be produced? Primarily, more factories and machines to make factory owners even richer, and after that, maybe some consumer goods.
Economists and historians will be thrilled to learn this fact. It's time to go back and rewrite the history books. It's time to go back and rewrite what we know about the Industrial Revolution. It's time to change all of that based on this claim made by EE. Or more accurately, that is what we would do if it wasn't almost completely opposite the actual truth. It wasn't almost a complete 180-degree turn. Now, in his quote, and indeed in this video in general, EE does not say specifically which country he's referring to when he's talking about the facts or the facts in his video, but we can assume that it's England because England is the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, and in fact at one point England was called the workshop of the world. So how do we square this, that fact that England was called the workshop of the world at one point, and compare that and contrast that to EE's claims that he's just made? Okay, so this part's going to be really fun. I'm going to be going into the output statistics for England during the 18th and the 19th centuries, which is when the Industrial Revolution was taking place. But first I want to go with this quote from Clark, who says, by 1850, at the apogee of its power, Britain had 1.8% of the world population. The area of the British Isles is only about 0.16% of the world landmass. Yet Britain then produced 2/3 of the world output of coal and 1/2 of world production of cotton textiles and iron. Output per worker was higher in Britain than in any other country. But it wasn't just goods from the quote that saw an increase in output, and also not just total output, but output per person. Output of a vast array of goods rose during this time. And also these newly produced goods were cheap enough for the growing middle class at this time. Here we have one table showing the value added in industry, which is in millions of pounds in current dollars. And we have 1770, 1801, and 1831. And in every category there is an increase over this time period. We then have table 2, sectoral growth rates of real output and percentage per annum. Then we have cotton, wool, linen, silk, building, iron, copper, beer, leather, soap, candles, coal, and paper. It was like I was saying, it's a truly vast array of products at this time that saw an amazing amount of growth during this time period. And this is from 1700 all the way to 1831. Here we have industrial production per person on a segmented trend line, and we can see it increasing all the way back from 1300 all the way up to 1900. But the most important thing is that we see a huge increase in this. Once again, this is per person from about 1700s to the 1800s. You can see a large increase there. And on the vertical axis, that's a logarithmic scale. We then have a fairly similar looking graph. However, this is industrial production overall. Once again, we actually see a decrease initially from around 1300s to the 1400s, which might have something to do with the Black Death, which killed a lot of people. And then it starts up again around the 1450s, and then it increases. And once again, during the period that we're talking about, let's say 1750 to 1850, or maybe 1700 to 1850, we see a huge increase in industrial production. Here we have something a little bit different. We have estimated annual rates of growth of real output from 1700 to 1871, and in percentages. However, in this, we have different people and their percentage growth. However, we can see for all of them, the growth over this time period increased. Of course, the magnitudes are different across each of these estimates, but the point is that there is an increase in the rate of growth of real output over this time period. We have another table which is exports growth from 1700 to 1851. And as you can see, we have nominal GDP, we have exports as a percentage of GDP, but we also have industrial exports as a percentage of industrial product. And once again, that increases over this period as Britain starts exporting more of its final goods that are made in its factories and then exports it overseas. And this is how it becomes the workshop of the world. And finally, I thought it'd be fun to show the amount of books produced over this time period from 1700 to 1800. And here we see a huge increase in the amount of books produced. And whilst books aren't necessarily something we associate with the Industrial Revolution, it was still aided by industrial technologies at the time. You were still able to produce more given the new technologies that were coming into being during this time period. And just to give another quote, we have this from Clark, who says, "The output of a group of manufactured products whose quantities are measurable, textiles, metals, sugar, beer, hides, paper, tobacco, soap, and candles, increased sixfold over these years." So what I wanted to show with all of these statistics is that output rose enormously over this period. And that is one of the main reasons that you have this factory system. The introduction of the factory system was in part to produce more stuff. And not just to produce more stuff, but to produce it more cheaply. And that's the point. If you're the only factory in town, you can choose exactly how much you want to produce, but that's not what happened. It's not a matter of just one factory setting up and then choosing to produce as little as possible. No, there was a lot of competition, and so factories had to keep producing. And through this competition and through the amount of technology, the amount of factories growth, obviously population growth and all of that, that is how we get at least part of the story behind the Industrial Revolution. Of course, there are many other factors, but one of the things that allowed England to become the workshop of the world was the factory system. And regardless of the intentions of any individual factory owner, that almost doesn't matter. It's almost a wash because they had to compete. They had no choice and they had to increase output. And that is exactly what we see from the statistics that I've shown. But we get the next quote from EE, who says the following.
How should it be produced? It should be produced in said factories with a combination of heavy machinery and low-paid labourers.
Okay, so this point about unskilled labour in factories, or unskilled labour predominantly working in factories, that only comes into being later in the Industrial Revolution. What happens at the turn of the IR is that we see highly skilled people are required to work in these new factories. Because that's the point. These factories represent a new way of working, and you can't just bring unskilled people in to do some manual or some easy tasks that have been set out in the past, because these tasks haven't been done before. And so you need skilled people to come in first. They set up the routines, they set up the factory system for a few generations, and then only then can unskilled people come in and work. And of course, a lot of the working conditions were pretty terrible. But if you were a low-skilled person, you could certainly do worse than work in one of these factories. And at the very least, if you were in a city, there was actually competition among factory owners for workers. And so if conditions in one factory weren't right, at least there was a sense that you could change jobs and you could go into another factory. Whereas before, you might either be an agricultural worker or agrarian worker, or you might work in what's called the putting out system, where production was done mostly in the home. Now, all of a sudden, you had to adopt to a new way of working in the factory system. And for some people, going from working from home to then working in a factory did mean they did lose a little bit of money because some of their skills were not transferable. However, that's only for a relatively small segment of the population. Eventually, over time, people did start getting paid more as they built up their skills. And the other thing is that generally people started young, and assuming of course you survived into your adulthood, you actually did start earning more money as you built up skills. And for a lot of people, they could get more money by starting young in these factories and then working their way up. They could get a higher salary later on in life than they could if they worked in the putting out system at home, or of course in the agricultural system. And so I want to end this on two quotes, one from Mokyr, who says, "To describe the new technology, whether in large mills or small workshops, as de-skilling, so popular in some circles, is to oversimplify the complex new reality that emerged in the age of the early factory." And then the following quote we get, "In Lancashire and Glasgow, male cotton factory workers in 1834 experienced earnings age profiles that were consistent with investment in human capital at a younger age. enjoying significantly higher earnings in their late 20s and 30s than in their later teens, suggesting that experience and on-the-job training were required in the manufacturing sector as well. And so it's not a simple story of people being forced to work in these factories and then being low skilled for the rest of their lives and then earning very little money or seeing very little growth in their earnings. A lot of people did, in fact, see benefits from working in the factory systems. Even as I've said already, that some of these factory jobs were not pleasant in the slightest. But once again, that did apply to a surprisingly small amount of factory jobs over this time period. And so if we take it as a whole, a lot of people chose to work in these new factories, in this new factory system, in this new way of working, because overall it provided more benefits than it did drawbacks, even if in some cases the drawbacks could be significant. But then EE goes on to say the following.
And for whom should it be produced? Well, the people that own the factories and those who can afford it, of course.
Okay, so this part is very, very, very wrong. These new factories and the products that they were producing, they were specifically made so they could be cheaper. They were specifically made en masse. This is the time of mass production. And they were made because they were cheaper and more could be sold. And so previously, as I mentioned, when you did production, it was mostly in the home in what's called the putting out system. And these products, by virtue of being handmade and by being produced on a much smaller scale, were more expensive. And also people working in this system predominantly used manual labor to produce these products, and they simply could not compete with the new factory system, which started using machinery, even if it took a while for machinery in factories to take off. But the point is, they simply could not compete, and it was a matter of where they had to stop doing their work from home and they had to join the new factory system. But it was, as I was pointing out earlier, these people, the first wave of people to join the factories, they actually had a lot of skills that they brought with them from working from home, from this putting out system. And they brought those skills to the factory system, and they actually got paid a pretty decent wage. But where EE alludes to these new industrialists predominantly creating products for the industrialists, we then have to ask, how many were there? I mean, why bother creating products for such a small subset of the population? If these new industrialists were simply rich people or nobles or what have you, well-connected people in society, I mean, what's the point of creating factories, of employing potentially hundreds of people, or in some cases thousands of people, to produce products? But if no one's purchasing them, what's the point? And at that point, there's no point in creating factory. You might as well just stick to the old system. And these people might use some machinery at home, but certainly nothing that had external power, which is exactly something that factories eventually brought down the line, which then enabled more production, which, if demand stays the same, allows for the prices of these products to drop. That's the point. That is how England became the workshop of the world. It didn't do it through expensive products made for the few. I mean, no one's buying them. You can't become the workshop of the world for a few people. No, they were able to do it on a mass market level. And so the main point I want to conclude with is that factories are created precisely to create a lot of something. And more specifically, a lot of a few specific goods. And you can then create these new products at a lower price, and you can easily destroy the competition, which at this time was people working from home. And then your only other competition becomes other factories. And then factories evolve and change over time. But then EE goes on to say the following.
Where workers will strike to demand better pay or conditions. But this wasn't so simple in the 1800s. For starters, factory owners still had a lot more negotiating power than even their entire pool of factory workers. Even if by some miracle someone managed to organise an industry-wide strike, factory owners could just sit back on their estates, wind their operations down, and wait for workers to starve into submission.
What? How? This implies factories were simple, cheap, and easy to set up. If that was the case, why only create a few presumably expensive products, given EE's earlier claim? You as a factory owner had competition, of course, and if it was so easy to set up and sell expensive products, more people would simply set up shop and then lower the prices of these products. But in reality, the factories required large investments, and it is not a simple matter of, quote, shutting them down, end quote, as soon as any trouble hits. You would protect your investment, first and foremost. And what EE claims was possible is simply not what happened. Worker strikes were often met with force, especially in the Third World, where worker syndicate leaders would even get assassinated for striking. But it's not just the third world, there were many strikes in England and America that were brutally put down. And following on from this, one such example is the American Steel Company and the American Fruit Company in South America. They would send hitmen after striking workers, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of documented killings in such fashion. Alright, so I'm going to end the video there. There are more things to nitpick, but at this point it is becoming just a nitpick. And there's a lot of political claims that EE makes in this video that I'm not going to touch in this video series. I might summarize those in another video, but for this video I just wanted to stick to the economic claims. So the main thing, if we draw together all 4 parts, the main thing about the Industrial Revolution, or simply the IR, is that it's very, very complex. Yes, conditions for some workers were absolutely terrible. They were disastrous, and a lot of people would not work these jobs if given a choice. But to claim that a majority of people were effectively enslaved to these conditions is simply not correct either. Yes, there were many unskilled workers working in factories, but this came later down the line when factories had their systems in place, when such people could work in factories. Such unskilled labor could not work in the factories when they first started up. The first generations of people were actually highly skilled people, and they were paid a wage premium. However, it should be noted that this wage premium was there as a compensating wage. That meant that you got paid extra to compensate you for the fact that you were working in such dangerous conditions. There were also people who could choose how they wanted to work, and working conditions were not universal across the board. Some industries had it worse than others. For example, the textile industry saw some of the worst labor practices at this time. Basically, they were the idea that we conjure up when we think of a factory at this time. But even as late as 1850s, the large factory, which employed hundreds or in some cases thousands of workers, was actually still not the norm in England at this time. It was still small and smallish workshops, which might employ a dozen to a few dozen people. And factory conditions varied across different factories at this time, especially in the cities where there was actually competition for workers. Because in the city it made it easier for you to find a job, but it also made it easier for an employer to find you as well. And because of this competition, eventually, admittedly quite slowly, over time conditions did improve. However, there is another but. Even during this period, from about 1700 to about 1850s, the quality of life for most people actually did not improve all that much. A lot of the improvements in the quality of life only came about towards the end of the 19th century, and then of course going into the 1900s. But I hope you've enjoyed this series, and in particular today's video. I thought it was a particularly fun one. And it's best to stop it here because there's always more EE videos to critique, so I've got to get to some of those eventually. And in going forward, I'm going to be working with other people, and I'm going to be working on videos such as MMT, or Modern Monetary Theory, and taxation, savings, all that kind of stuff. And all the good stuff that relates to the macroeconomy, or the aggregate economy. But that is the end for this video. Thank you for watching, but give this video a like, subscribe, rate and share. Also hit that bell notification because that helps me tremendously as well. And I'll see you guys in the next video.